South Africa will not interfere with the U.S. refugee program for white minority. Email says, this is the title of an article published on the 7th of January, 2026 by Reuters, lead journalist Ted Hessen. U.S. and South African officials reached an agreement during a closed-door meeting in late December to allow the United States to continue its controversial effort to bring white South Africans to the U.S. as refugees. An internal meeting summary viewed by Reuters shows this. Controversial for whom? South Africa's government? Is a refugee program for Rohingya controversial? No, and neither is this one, except for leftists pushing the racist narrative, South Africa's politicians, the ANC, and its corrupt media. Now, the meeting came after President Trump's signature refugee program was disrupted days earlier when South African authorities, in an extraordinary move on December 16th, a public holiday, Geloftedag, or Reconciliation Day, raided a U.S. refugee processing site in Johannesburg, arresting Kenyan contractors and sparking a backlash from Washington. But to correct this story, the backlash was about the doxing of an American official performing a diplomatic mission, processing refugee aspirants under UN refugee-approved standards, something done repeatedly in the past, inside South Africa by the very same vendor, with no issues whatsoever. And I've interviewed an American citizen who worked in Kenya with that vendor and went to South Africa with the visa approved by the South African government to process refugees to get out of South Africa, except those were Congolese and Somalis. Apparently, the government of South Africa doesn't want to see its tax base erode and won't let South Africans go, even though that's a violation of UN standards. At this December 23rd meeting, the top U.S. diplomat in South Africa at the moment, because Ambassador Brent Bozell is yet to arrive, that would be the Chargé d'Affaires Mark Dillard, who arrived from Nigeria earlier last year, received assurances from Pretoria that South Africa would not interfere with Trump's program, according to the meeting summary, which was signed by Dillard and sent to various U.S. agencies and somehow wound up in the hands of Reuters. Classified information. This process is empty. There are many ways to disrupt and interfere with refugee processing. An assurance from South African officials means nothing, such as intimidation of aspirants with visible security presence, filming people at processing sites, SAPs appearing at your door or business, a sudden tax audit, slow-rolling passport applications, and renewals or birth certificate requests, as well as fraudulent criminal accusations and cases against you. We may not agree with the classification of certain South Africans as facing possible genocide, but their right to move to a destination of their choice is guaranteed, and the government of South Africa won't interfere. That's a summary quoting of Thabo Tage, one of the South African officials in the meeting. And of course they won't. That's guaranteed under South Africa's constitution, and the South African government violated the rights of South Africans by interfering with that. But what they agree with isn't even germane. Not a single refugee admitted to the United States came under a white genocide claim. That's just a leftist fantasy used to distract and discourage people. Every single one of the South Africans who's come here has been admitted on a verified claim of unjust racial persecution. Additionally, the title of the article is incorrect and advances a false leftist narrative. The program is for racial minorities suffering unjust persecution. And I've said this since February 7th, thousands of times. The media know this, yet stories continue to propagate this myth. To date, that group has included Afrikaners and other white South Africans, coloreds, Indians, and even a few black South Africans. Yes, even a few black South Africans are in the United States as refugees as a consequence of unjust racial persecution. Now, screw your head on for that one. South African officials did not fully commit to investigating how a U.S. refugee officer's passport image leaked before being posted online and offered only a tepid response to Washington's push to get to the bottom of what happened, according to the meeting summary, which had not previously been reported. Now, the problem here is that this is a criminal act. It's a violation of South African law, and it's also a violation of the Vienna Conventions, putting the life of a diplomat at risk. The United States State Department said that despite the unacceptable events in December, its operations remain unhindered. The department said more Afrikaners arrived in the U.S. as refugees in December than any previous month, and that higher numbers were expected in January. And that's correct, folks. As I've previously reported, over half the 1,055 South African refugees currently in America, 595, arrived in just 17 days in December. That's a pace of 35 per day, up from several months ago when it was 2 per day, and then in November when it was 8 per day, 35 per day in December. When flights resumed on January 5th, 2026, that number had climbed to 50 per day already and continues to rise. Now, Reuters states that South Africa's Foreign Ministry, the Department of International Relations, Corporation, DERCO, rejected any suggestion that its officials were negotiating with the U.S. regarding the refugee program. Our position on the so-called refugee protection for South African citizens is unchanged. It's based on a false premise that lacks empirical evidence and has been rejected by South Africans of all backgrounds, according to the ministry. Now, the endless insults heaped on United States professional investigators and adjudicators who could run rings around the 30% education standard of DERCO apparatchiks is comical, or rather a sad commentary on the ineptitude and ignorance of South Africa's foreign ministry. Reuters, ostensibly from government source, either breaking the law by disclosing the information or the State Department intentionally passing it out for effect, states that the summary was emailed to U.S. State Department refugee program staff on Monday and labeled sensitive, which means you're not allowed to share it. Now, that suggests the two nations are quietly seeking a more collaborative approach following tense relations since Trump took office nearly a year ago. And I have to correct the record once again. These tense relations go back several years. For me personally, it goes back to 2001 when South Africa refused to sign an Article 98 waiver protecting U.S. soldiers under the Rome Statute. And it's continued and picked up pace under Ramaphosa, with him mocking the president at every turn. I don't know what Donald Trump knows about South Africa, but he can keep his America and we'll keep our South Africa. After lying to Bloomberg Press, saying there were no farmers in South Africa, we have documented evidence of over 3,500, close to 4,000 farmers and their family members tortured and murdered on South Africa's farms. That's just the white ones. Doesn't include the coloreds and Indians or black farmers. Now, DERCO falsely claims that the arrest of U.S. refugee program contractors was a law enforcement matter, not a diplomatic signal, and that the U.S. effort could proceed if it followed South African law. Now, it's strange that the arrest occurred at a location long known to South African authorities. And how did they know about it? The United States Embassy officials disclosed it to them. It happened on a public holiday. There were no other raids in South Africa that day. No spaza shops, no tuck shops, no illegal aliens deported from the country. It involved dozens of Border Management Authority officers paid overtime, resulted in unlawful detention of U.S. officials briefly, and the criminal doxing of one U.S. citizen's official passport. That's a clear violation of South African law, let alone the Vienna Convention. Not to mention the excuse given by the South African authorities twofold. This was a sting operation. How is it a sting operation? You knew where it was at. No one hid it from you. It's not a sting operation, and to claim that is comical. And the second thing is that they claim that the Kenyans who entered the country lawfully were working illegally. However, the Kenyans freely admitted, and the South African government also admitted, that they applied for a visa to allow them to work there after entering. That was denied. They made an appeal. That appeal was intentionally sent to the South African High Commission in Kenya. The Kenyans don't work at the South African High Commission in Kenya, in Nairobi. They were in South Africa, and they never received this notice that we know of. How would they have received it? Sending it to South African officials in Kenya to get to Kenyan nationals living in South Africa? It makes no sense whatsoever. They knew the U.S. government was responsible for these people. They could have given it to them or forwarded it to RSC. The South African government has had a relationship with RSC in the past. Yes, they have. Because, as I've said, Josh Mersave worked for RSC in Nairobi and traveled to South Africa and had a visa to work there to process refugees. So the South African authorities knew full well how to contact these people, and they intentionally sent it somewhere where they would never see it so that they could falsely claim that they ignored the final notice. That's disingenuous, that's dishonest, that's fraudulent. Now, Reuters also reports that during the 2-hour meeting late at night on December 23rd, the penultimate day before Christmas, South African officials appeared to seek a calm rather than confrontational approach with the U.S. Dillard met with two high-ranking South African diplomats, Deputy Minister Alvin Botha and Acting Chief Director for North America, Thabo Tanga. And Botha seemed concerned about the doxing of the American official, but Tanga seemed nonplussed and uninterested in pursuing it. And I will warn Mr. Tanga this: your lack of interest is at your peril. This issue is not over. You violated the Vienna Conventions. You intentionally sought to embarrass the world's most powerful nation by committing a criminal act and intentionally sending the final notice for rejection for people working in good faith to a country on the other side of the continent so they wouldn't know about it. And I think that says all you need to know about this. South African officials say they won't interfere, but we know that's nonsense. As I said, there are many ways to interfere and disrupt refugee applications, refugee processing: intimidating aspirants, unwarranted tax audits, showing up people's homes, intimidating them. Understand you apply for the refugee program. Well, how would you know about that? And now you're terrified. Slow rolling birth certificates and passport applications and renewals. The South African authorities hold all the cards, and any shameful conduct they want to pull, they can pull. Not much anybody can do about it. So their assurances that they won't disrupt the program are balderdash. What say you, South Africa? Mzansi. Cheers.